Hello, today we have our second program in the series on the arts of translation, the series of dialogues that we just launched with the Russian American Cultural Center. And today my guest is Mary Jane White, a lawyer, a poet, translator, and a visual artist, and the translator of this new book of Marina Tsvetaeva's poems, After Russia, Adelaide Books, 2021, Lisbon. Mary Jane White, welcome.
I'm very honored to be with you and to be your second guest. And I certainly enjoyed your interview with Dmitry Manin, the first of the series. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mary Jane, we will probably shed light on some parts of your career as we go, if we choose to. But I'd like to jump right in and to start to ask you how it all started. How did you begin to translate? Because all these stories are fascinating. People come to translating Russian literature in so many ways. Some of them are really peculiar. So yours was more or less traditional. How did it happen?
Well, it started with my failing French and Spanish in high school. I was a monolingual English speaker. I was raised in the South where there was not much cultural diversity. So of course, when I looked at a foreign language, I thought it was misspelled English. And that if I guessed, I was bright enough to guess right without a dictionary. It's a good way to fail both Spanish and French. So when I got to college, at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, I had to have 3 years of a foreign language to graduate. It's a requirement. I know that I had already failed Spanish and French, and I thought the German words were too long, and I thought the Russian alphabet was beautiful, especially when it was handwritten. And so I was drawn to the alphabet. And then, of course, once I got into studying Russian, I realized there were very few cognates between Romance languages and Slavic languages. And that meant I had to buy an Oxford Russian English dictionary. And that dictionary and I have been intimate friends. My dictionary has been rebound in letter 3 times.
I heard about that dictionary. It's a legendary dictionary. So I know that you studied with John Glad and with my late friend Daniel Weissbort.
Yes.
Who was one of those who started modern poetry in translation with Ted Hughes.
Yes.
Yeah. So these were I presume these were your first mentors when it comes to Russian poetry, per se.
Well, actually, my Russian teacher, Elena Sokol, who was actually Czech, is who taught me Russian for 3 years at Reed. And my sophomore year, because I was interested in poetry, and she was teaching out of the Merrill Sparks, very old anthology. So the sophomore year, because I was already interested in poetry and studying that very seriously, Elena agreed to meet with me one-to-one with my poetry teacher. And I think they wanted to be together for their own reasons in the afternoon. But I would come and they'd spend about an hour with me. And then I realized I need to get out of there. But I certainly learned a lot about poetry and a lot about Russian because I had 2 teachers working with me. I wasn't making translations, but I was reading them. And also at Reed, I met the 2 poets, Henry Carlisle and Sandra McPherson, introduced me to Mary Barnard, who was a graduate of Reed College and translated Sappho from the Greek. She had had a long correspondence with Ezra for years, and she was writing her memoir of that correspondence and her efforts in translation. So I went to see Mary about once a month, and we would spend hours together, and she would talk to me about reading translations. So I was reading Greek poets and translations. I was reading Ezra Pound. I was reading W.S. Merwin. I was reading many American poets who had a translation practice on the side. And so that was very beneficial by the time I got into graduate school, where I found John Glad and Danny Weissbort working on an anthology that they published, I think, in 1978. That was a New York Times notable book of the year. And I took a graduate
course, right?
I took a graduate course in translation with the two of them. And they put me on speed dating for translation. All of the poets, they kept the good poets for themselves, and they translated the big ones. But they needed the graduate students to sort of speed date through all the minor poets and translate them. And so it really was, here's a poem we need a translation of. Go work with the dictionary. We'll help you edit it when you get to a certain point. And then the other thing I was doing at the time is working with the International Writing Program in Iowa City, which invites mid-career writers from probably 50 countries, and then they stay for several months. And the lingua franca in which they discussed each other's work was English. And so my way of earning money to go to graduate school was to be the graduate school translator. So I would get a trot from Portuguese, and I would be expected within a week to produce a translation of a Portuguese short story or a Japanese poem with words written underneath the Japanese characters and told to make it into English so that the Japanese author could share with the Palestinian, Israeli, South African authors to do their presentation. So that gave me a lot of practice working with living authors and understanding how their voices were different and how they wanted to be presented to their peers. And then, Danny was wonderful, and so was John Glad. And so I had a lot of interesting opportunities once I got out of my hometown.
You certainly had. But you mentioned quite a few points that I wanted to return to.
Sure.
Quite a few of them. And even mentioning uttering the word voice is extremely important to me. And to any translator, I guess. And minor poets, I think that Sasha Sumerkin, about whom I hope will talk a little bit today, who holds a very special place in both our lives, he would take issue with with this term when it comes to Eduard Limonov, whom he really loved both as a prose writer and as a poet. But I'd like to return to Mary Barnard. And sure. It's fascinating how you, I know that you would drive to her to Vancouver for those sessions that I can only imagine. That's amazing, just even to imagine. Her correspondence with Ezra Pound, who encouraged her to translate in order to first of all, hone her own poetic skills. That's a very interesting idea, because I know that many translators will probably tell us that they started to translate just to keep their poetic muscles toned and learn something. But I know that in this book that you kindly sent me a while ago, A Starry Sky to Starry Sky, which is a 1988 book of your poetry and some translations from Marina Tsvetaeva. Not many at the end of the book, but a very interesting exchange between Tsvetaeva and one poem by Akhmatova dedicated, the famous poem dedicated to Marina Tsvetaeva. And you dedicated this book, the whole book, to Mary Barnard.
Yes.
I wonder, Mary Barnard, as you already mentioned, who is a famed translator of Sappho, that were so unusual, and the way they were unusual, as Dudley Fitt wrote in his foreword, that they were so pure, so hard, so stripped. Nothing. It's in a way it was anti-poetry, and it was a very unusual Sappho that is very often is kind of is presented in those very poetic, lovely lines that that include so much that is outside of her diction, as we can imagine it. We can guess on certain things, but we cannot really miss the main thing about her tone that is very pungent.
Yes.
And how Mary Barnard translated her. So I wonder, did you apply any of these principles? Of course, you translated different poets, and Marina Tsvetaeva is different, and yet there is so much la poésie, that is artificially injected in translation for various reasons, sometimes for the sake of padding and meter keeping, or for whatever reasons, or because the translator thinks it sounds more lovely, but the reader may disagree. So,
Mary was a very, very hard-minded, regal person. And, I can't say that I ever felt close to her. I was a little person who came and sat at her feet because she was quite regal. And she talked about the Sappho translation. Of course, in her translation, you can tell what line she's added of her own as context for the fragment, because she indicates that typographically. But in terms of translating the little fragments, she's very hard, very spare, very clean, very much within the modernist, imagist tradition that followed after Pound, okay? So she was not trying to pad, or if she added a line, she gave you the typography to let you know this is my thought about how I read this poem. And then as far as the lines were going, at the time I visited with her, she was actually working on a translation of the Iliad, which has never been published. Somebody needs to go dig that out and, make a graduate PhD thesis out of it or something. But she was talking about how within the line, there would be a certain amount of content as thought, as sound, the length of the line, the voice, the lyric voice in Sappho's case, the narrative voice perhaps in Homer's case, and how if you kept the content of the line within the line, that would assist with the pace, which you certainly want to reproduce the thinking pace, the observing pace of the poet who's writing in the original, so that you don't distort that by giving more attention to things that don't deserve it, and by attending to the things that are of the heart or of the controlling emotion, or that are the point of the story. And so she was very strict on herself in trying to confine content of one line to one line in the translation. She also said that if you could control the pace, you would be able to control the tone of the voice, the tone of the poem, whether it was elegiac or lyric or any one of a number of types of recognizable poems or thought forms that we practice in poetry. And so she was pretty strict about saying, you know, this is something I try to do and it's helpful to me. And then, of course, because she was working in the modernist imagist tradition, she was not very interested in rhymes or meters, although she was very aware of all the Greek meters. She was not out to reproduce Greek meters in English.
Which is smart, because
she discarded that as a task.
Yeah, one can't reproduce meters, and we're saying meters, not rhythm, and very
right.
Different.
That's not to say that she didn't pursue beauty in English, in the English that she was writing. And, you know, I think what she was doing was very carefully reading Sappho, and she was giving a report of her reading in a beautiful way that you could begin to encounter enough of Sappho in English that if you were truly interested, you might go learn Greek. Yeah, that was really where she was coming from.
Would it be your motive or some kind of intention when it comes to Tsvetaeva, when you do that? The first time I encountered your translation, as you know, was when we both were contributors to Inventory. Oh, you even have it here? You must have it somewhere. But
I have one issue of it. The Journal of Translation from Princeton.
It's the very good journal of translation that is published by the Princeton University. And I think it was issue number 8. And we were both in it. I was there at the launch of in Princeton, at the launch of this issue. So I'm sitting in this, flimsy plastic chair, and I'm fidgeting with the copy, that beautiful copy, which is very interestingly bound, and flipping through it. And suddenly I see Marina Tsvetaeva's translations, and I say, yeah, well, right. someone is very audacious. And the first thing that I noticed, the first feature, was exactly the pace, hence the tone, and something about the texture that was recognizable. And that was already so much for me, because it already relayed the tone and the voice in so many ways. But the pace, without too much emotion that would be injected, taken out and then re-ejected in the new version, which is in a different language, in a different medium, right? This is what is very often done. You extract some abstract things like rhythm or emotion out of the original, and then eject it back in this new cast of this new form in the different medium, and it never works, of course. So in this case, it was something happened, and I was eager to get to know more of your work. How did it happen that you started translating Tsvetaeva? I know that there was a huge interest to women poets, but to me, it's a little bit of a kind of it's a little bit artificial, just to me personally. I don't really split poetry in 2 sections or 3 sections, gender-wise. To me, it's just one poetry, and this is me. I know it's not in my view is not in these days, but
well, your view is in accord. Your view is in accord with Mary Barnard. I mean, part of her regality was she was the only woman poet invited to contribute to a small volume of contemporary American poets that was published by New Directions by James Laughlin. She found out that all the men had been asked if she could be included. She was royally pissed. Okay?
Was it 1960s or 70s?
This would be in the 1960s.
60s.
Okay.
It reminds me of Bishop, who refused to participate in any anthology that would invite her just to keep the balance between male and female authors, or in all women anthologies. She would just.
Right. It's like Tsvetaeva herself showing up in an army coat to a reading.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
She didn't want to be. She didn't want to be reduced to a poetess.
You're talking about Mary Barnard, right?
I'm talking about Mary Barnard, but I'm also talking. I think there was a famous reading where Tsvetaeva showed up. Right, dressed in a male army coat.
Yeah, but that was a little bit fashionable. We're talking about the Silver Age. That was slightly different. It was actually kind of cool. But certainly in the 1970s, early 1970s, this attitude is not cool in America. And same with Elizabeth Bishop that I just mentioned, who just refused to do that. And interesting, by the way, an interesting parallel, speaking of correspondence between Barnard and Pound and Bishop and Robert Lowell, right? Interesting similarities, but we will not push that any further because
one of the things that Mary, of the things Mary and I talked about, of course, was Elizabeth Bishop, because the introduction to Bishop for Mary Barnard came through Pound. Okay. So when Pound was there in St. Elizabeth's, it was the great salon. Everybody came to the Madhouse to meet the poet and to meet other poets and to get assignments and to get criticism and to share and to carry on, And so Mary was mentored by Pound in many ways. He got her the job at the Buffalo, the small magazine collection at Buffalo. She climbed up in William Carlos Williams' attic to get the old, early literary magazines that Pound and Williams and Stevens and Bishop and all those people published in, to drag them off to the library. But, I think what happened with me and Tsvetaeva is, in the Markov book that I read in college, there was a translation, a verse translation, because these were all verse translations, of an attempt at jealousy. And I remember encountering that poem, which is, of course, is addressed to Mark Slonim, and is it's a sort of classic. Tsvetaeva seems to write this poem over and over again of, just incredible female dismissal of the male lover. He's out the door. And she's just, I read that poem and I thought, I don't think I've seen women write that poem. I've seen a lot of women feel that way, but I haven't heard them put it on the page quite the way she did. And so, it stuck in my mind. I think I remember, that poem attracted me enough that I went and got the dictionary and looked up all the words so that I could really read it, because there was a lot of padding and there was a lot of rhyming in English that was done, by someone maybe who hadn't been even trained in writing English rhyme. So, I was frustrated, but that sent me to the dictionary. And then, I went to law school and I wasn't writing. And when I came back to the writer's workshop about halfway through law school, and I ran into, John and Danny, and they were sending me off on this sort of speed dating, all these different poets. And I wasn't really falling in love with any of them. I mean, I don't think I would have spent a great deal of time or energy or effort with anyone that I was assigned to translate. But it did hone my skills. But I was sort of looking, who would I fall in love with deeply enough that I would really want to spend time translating? And Danny and John invited Joseph Brodsky because Danny was working very frustratedly on trying to translate Brodsky, and Brodsky was being very resistant to wanting to translate himself. So in order to settle some of their differences, Brodsky was invited out to Iowa, to meet, and they were going to hash it out. And of course, he did some presentations to graduate students, and I was in the audience, and I asked him, because I knew he had a mentoring relationship from Akhmatova. So I started asking questions about Akhmatova. But for myself, I asked, because my Russian is so poor, I can't just pick it up and read it. I thought, well, I'll ask the expert. I said, who among the Russian poets deserves a translator? Who needs to be translated? And of course he said, well, Tsvetaeva hasn't had a good translator yet. And it's impossible, you can't do it. But of Pasternak, Manushdam, Tsvetaeva, and Akhmatova, the other three have found a variety of good translators, but Tsvetaeva has not. And she was the greatest poet among them in his view that day. He said the greatest poet in the 20th century was a woman. Well, that kind of sent me back to modern Russian poetry, my old textbook. And
what he mentioned about when he quoted Akhmatova saying that compared to Marina.
Yes.
I'm a
yes.
I think that alone would already send someone to research, right?
Exactly. Then I thought, okay, I can quit speed dating. I can go take a look at this. And I did. And what I actually found was Versti, which is the series of poems that Tsvetaeva wrote addressed to Akhmatova, trying to get her attention, I think, because I think, Tsvetaeva felt like the little sister trying to get the attention of the big sister, the big literary sister. So she wrote these poems. There are two parts to the cycle. One is very lyrical, and one is focused around more religious themes.
Tsvetaeva came to the forefront of your attention, and you started translating her. And here I want to ask you, I have so many questions to ask, of course, but there is one question that bothers me, that has been bothering me all along. I find it interesting that many, this practice with which I do not really agree, that very often translators try to, some of them even say it just explicitly, sometimes it's implicit, but they try to find an analogy in the target language. For example, translating Tsvetaeva was a woman, so we are looking for a woman. Who does she really sound like? Well, Sylvia Plath or Anne Sexton, Passions, or a lot of dashes, Emily Dickinson. So we have, and all these, of course, are completely, I think it's a recipe for disaster in my book. Some people find it productive. I don't know. I don't think that we should even look for an analogy. And we should approach, I think, each poet, if there is any should, I think that we should approach each voice as a unique voice. And Tsvetaeva, especially Tsvetaeva, who was everything that is not. She was, even as an emigre, she was not your typical emigre in 1920s in any of the cities that she happened to stay for a long time: Berlin, Paris, Prague. She was rejected by everything. She was not even a transplanted poet, as many others, like someone who would sit for hours in a cafe and, being a poet. She was none of these things. And certainly it's a unique voice, unique texture. It's interesting that you mentioned an attempt at jealousy, because that was exactly the poem that I dealt with in my recent essay, where titled Marina Akhmataeva, the great tragic Russian poet, something like this. I wrote it in Russian. That Akhmataeva, so it's a blend of Akhmatova and Tsvetaeva, and this is what happens to some naive readers who pretty much blending the two voices, sometimes more than two voices, but in this case, it's obvious two of the four, Mandelstam, Pasternak, Tsvetaeva, Akhmatova, two women, two men, two Muscovites, two people from St. Petersburg, and so forth. And Akhmatova happens to have a poem on the same subject, an attempt at jealousy. It's a poem without a title. Я не любви твоей прошу. I'm not begging for your love in some translations. D.M. Thomas translation, it starts like that. So what you have are two very different, as different as can be. And the translations are much closer to each other than the originals that are polar opposites. So I'm dealing with this and discussing all these issues in my essay, and it was exactly, the essay was dedicated exactly to that poem. So this is very interesting. So can you please say a few words about this method of analogy, and on the other hand, on this very unfortunate phenomenon of blending of voices in the new language, especially for the readers who are not familiar with the original language?
Well, I think of Akhmatova and Tsvetaeva as very different voices, even if you bring them into English. And for myself, as I wanted to read her, my process is very sort of immersive into the diction and into the dictionary. Because my Russian is so poor, I don't think I could find my way to the bathroom in Moscow because I wouldn't know the words together. And I have to check very carefully my grammar because I'm just not a very good language student. So I really have to dig. And what that gives me is the kind of, I don't know if you've ever done tax returns, but it puts you into a number intoxication because you're dying to find out how it's going to come out, right? And you get just a little bit intoxicated as you do this scut work to develop what's going to go into the tax return. And for me, the translation is very much like that, because what I would do is I would look at each word in the line. I would look at the line as a unit. When I looked up a word, I wanted to know everything about that word that I could find in the dictionary to get a better sense of the tone of that word. How is that word used? What sort of phrases does it pop up into? How many definitions does it have? How resonant a word is it? Sometimes you translate, let's say, the name of a tree, and it's got to be a rolling tree, and you can't make it anything else unless you're going to really take liberties for some reason. So some words are confined and very concrete, and other words are quite resonant. And then you can make a lot of choices that will have to do with the voice and that will have to do with the pace and the tone. But the sort of scut work of sort of immersing myself in the poem word by word gave me a sort of immersion into the entire diction of the poem. Then I would try to puzzle out the line and puzzle out the grammar and puzzle out the stanza and think about why was stanza 1 the way it was and why did stanza 2 follow? How many of the lines were jammed so that, the thought of the line is proceeding on into the next line. And as I made these translations, and finally when I did the final edits through the entire book, I really made a decision that I wanted to preserve as much as I possibly could of Tsvetaeva's punctuation, because I think it's essential to the staccato, sometimes a breathless, sometimes, well, she was criticized, by the men for being hysterical. But those aspects of her punctuation, I tried to keep those in the translation. But for the kind of translation I was making, I really wanted to introduce her voice, her way of thinking. She makes parallelisms. There's a great deal of logical structure to her poetry. Okay, and
you can get Hegelian, right?
Yes, almost very much so, very much so. And I think that structure, that deep structure in the poem of the, you can get dazzled by her imagery, by her sound, but I think you also have to think, as Pound did, not only of the images, but the Melopoeia, but also the logopoeia. What is the logic of this poem? And to do that, you have to preserve, I think, the punctuation, the line content, line by line, the stanza. Don't mess with the stand breaks, try to keep to it. And that immersion in the sort of word by word examination will prepare you to make all of the choices that go rightly together to make a translation of taking Tsvetaeva from her Russian into a sort of modernist canon in English. So she isn't going to adopt the voice of Sylvia Plath or Elizabeth Bishop, or I'm not going to try to translate her into a known English voice.
That's exactly what I was asking. Yeah, and it's enjambment, of course, her famed enjambment, which is so characteristic for her diction. It's all of these things. It's a breath, of course. It has to do with breathing, but all these amazing things and her amazing technical achievements that are byproducts of her thinking, of her thinking in terms of mellows, also in so many ways, thinking in many ways on many levels, and of her mind, right?
Right, and it's interesting when you finally translate a large enough body of the work, you begin to see her repeating certain strategies. Okay, she's encountered this sort of problem, or she's thinking about this thing, and she thinks about it in the same sort of way, so that I see early poems from some of the early work I translated being written again, but she's older and she's in a different place.
She's very much
some of the strategies are very much an echo of earlier things that she's been interested in.
Of course, and she was strategically trying to distance her, by the way, speaking of Akhmatova, distance her from Akhmatova and somehow unfold her own diction, which would be very hers and very, very different from Akhmatova's, who had been already famous and already had a niche, right? So she wanted to develop something different. But I know that you have this thrice-bound Oxford Dictionary, and of course, this meticulous work with word is it's fascinating. However, that said, a translator who is not a native speaker needs a consultant who would try to convey all the million references, idioms, and tonal subtleties. So I know of one of your consultants who happened to be your and my dear friend, my friend's dear friend, the legendary Alexander Sumerkin, who was a legend of New York in a way, and loved by so many people. but he was extremely strict. As kind as he was extremely strict when it came to translation. I remember him shouting, yelling in the middle of some publishing house about someone doing really bad job on Brodsky translation. And that was the first time I actually heard him yell, because he took this thing to heart. And I know that you met him at Rusica, where he worked as a publisher and as an editor. Can you just say a few words about him and his help, his assistance when you translated Miles 1 and Miles 2?
Yes. We also worked on New Year's, a translation of New Year's, the Elegy for Rilke. So this is the kind of thing I used to get from Sasha. Big, long pages. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. This is just his comments on the very short poems that are in Starry Sky to Starry Sky. Okay. So the way I met him is I went to buy the rights to be able to translate from the Rusica text, because I didn't want to get crossways with them. And so I drove to New York because I couldn't get them to answer the telephone. And they didn't seem to have a number. So I went to their address and I just drove up and I parked the car and I hoped I wouldn't get a ticket. And I went up and I introduced myself and said, I have a National Endowment for the Art grants to translate Tsvetaeva, and I want to buy the rights to do it. He said, oh, well, we need to see some of your work. And so I had some. And he looked at it, he said, you need to meet somebody. And he took me down the hallway and he introduced me to Sasha. And we had a very brief conversation. And David insisted that I have Sasha work with me. And so what we agreed to do is I would send Sasha a text. Sasha would send me all these comments. He would correct my grammar. He would tell me about the word. He would tell me stories about where the poem fell into her biography.
All in writing, yes?
Yeah, all in writing. He would send all this to me as a huge gift.
Very Sasha. Very.
Then we would schedule a phone call. Okay. And because I had already met Mary Barnard, who was very strict, it didn't strike me as odd that Sasha would be strict. And he was very strict. And we would have big fights on the phone. I would go through his notes, and he would instruct me, and he would correct me, and he was wonderfully kind about it. And then he said, you have to read, New Year's, and you're not quite ready to translate it, but we should read it together. And he took me through that poem the same way. And, then I wound up needing to take a break from translation because my son was born and then diagnosed with autism. So there were about 15 years I did not do any work. When I came back after 15 years, I discovered that Sasha was no longer with us. And I can't tell you how sad I was about that. But in the Rusica edition of Tsvetaeva, he's written in the back of each one of the volumes all of the various lines that have been discovered in her drafts, the kinds of things that he was telling me. And so when I got to After Russia, I felt like Sasha was still there in the notes that he had prepared and that Rusica had published with the text. So,
but you also had another, and then I want to talk a little bit about something very different. You also had another consultant, or consultants rather. I read in your essay that it's interesting. We have another common mutual acquaintance, Stefan Delbos, who was my classmate actually at MFA, who lives in Prague and edits Prague Review. wonderful. I think he's a doctorate. He's a PhD professor in Massachusetts. So you met with him, and you went to Prague. He wrote to you, rather, and you went to Prague, and probably you met Galina Vanichkova in Czech, who had a Czech scholar who had this Tsvetaeva center in Shonori, and you consulted some undergrads, right? Some grad or undergrad students who were native Russian speakers. And that's wonderful, because actually people from the street can tell you a lot about Tsvetaeva too, or many other things, right? So
right.
That's another consultant.
Well, Stefan, I was practicing law. I think I was working on a murder case, and the phone rang, and it was Stefan Delbos calling from Prague. And he said, "Are you the Mary Jane White who sometimes translates Tsvetaeva?" And I thought, oh my God, who is this person? I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "We want to republish your translation of the poem of the end, which had been published in the Hudson Review." And then I decided, I got an invitation to go to Prague and read at the Tsvetaeva Center, and Galina was there. And the way we did the reading was, there was a scholar, I think, who talked a little bit about how being in Czechoslovakia had changed some of Tsvetaeva's diction while she wrote there in Prague. It was very, very interesting. I'm not sure I understood all of it, but it was fascinating. And they took me around and they showed me all the different Tsvetaeva sites, but also they sat with me for a day and read to me. And Galina read me the poem of the end. She stopped by and read the entire poem for me so that I could hear it. It was marvelous. And I owe that invitation to Stefan Delbos. Yes.
Happenstance. So you just mentioned the 15-year long break that you had to take from translation or whatever else was not dealing with your son Rafin's autism. And you are an absolute hero, and actually a torch for people who shows that you're a hero who shows that it can be done. And Rafin's success is it's just amazing. And congratulations on that. I was especially touched by your story when you still try to do something, and you were invited by the monks of the Benedictine University to use some monk cells on weekends to work on your translations. And in a different place of your essay, you write about your court experience, because you're a court lawyer. Courthouse lawyer. So you drive from courthouse to courthouse, and you carry your thrice-bound Oxford dictionary that we know so much about already to the court. And while you're waiting to be called for whatever duties, mysterious lawyer's duty you have, you are working on translation, including Tsvetaeva translation, I presume. So that's very interesting. But one might be curious, what is it about law? Because especially with an analytical poet like Tsvetaeva, she's very analytical, right? Some people think she's just always, passionate tornado, but she's very analytical and very structured and very much in control. What is it about being a lawyer? Is there any, or it's just you happen to be a lawyer? Is there any connection?
I think of myself sort of as a mouthpiece. When I go in as a lawyer, I am not there in my primary capacity. I mean, I'm not the principal. I represent someone. I represent someone who doesn't know the courtroom, who might be fearful of the courtroom, and who might really screw it up in the courtroom if they don't know what the rules are. So I am that mouthpiece that channels the message that the court needs to hear And
there's something about logic too there, right?
yes, absolutely. I mean, law is a matter of first things first, second things second, third things third, and don't get them out of order because it won't work.
So there is some connection between law and translation. I think there is even more if we start thinking about it. I think
right. Well, and you think about some of the wonderful poets who trained as lawyers.
Yeah, and actually channeling someone else's voice, like what you're describing, that you're a mouthpiece. That's an interesting term. In this
well,
case.
I think of that when I translate. I'm not the poet.
Yeah,
I'm not writing the poem.
Channeling in a way.
I am channeling the poem. It helps to have a little, I don't know, mockingbird gene, a little parrot gene.
Remember, Limonov said that there's something. He said there's something about parrot-like about me that helps in translation.
But also, I think too, there's an advocacy part of translation. In the same way that you would go in and advocate in a courtroom, you are advocating for a position, you're advocating for someone else, you may be advocating over certain weaknesses and guilt, you still have to represent. And you have to keep your own credibility. You can't make it up, and you can't pad it, and you can't get away with lying.
And it's bad in law.
In law.
Yeah.
And those things, the kinds of integrities of the advocate are the integrities of the translator, and you are the mouthpiece in another language for someone else.
And we cannot purge ourselves in translation, right? We cannot purge ourselves. We cannot really break some laws.
But I also think, it's a matter of speed dating and the difference between that and marriage. I mean, you can't, not everybody can translate everybody. Not everybody can sleep with everybody. You have to look for the compatible person. And then, the advocacy skills become worth really pulling out and making a long-term commitment. Because I think, Tsvetaeva's taken me through every other personal relationship that I've had has been shorter than the relationship that I've had with Tsvetaeva.
Every good marriage should have something about, off-speed dating too.
Yes.
So, but about being an advocate, I found it's interesting because I prepared this little quote from your essay that I really find very moving and very appropriate. You say, so these translations, right, and you're talking about Tsvetaeva translations. So these translations are thrown off as the residue of my reading. I trust that the residue of my reading, as one poet hoping to read another, is the gift to my readers in English who might otherwise have no opportunity of coming to hear anything of Tsvetaeva's own still hidden Russian voice. And I know that you translated Gumilyov, you translated Khodasevich and Ivanov, Vyacheslav Ivanov. So those were speed dating, and of course, Eduard Limonov. I want to finish with this very short episode when you and I and Patricia Solner created this panel on dissidents. And obviously, I want to say just a few words about it these days, because I often think of Natalia Gorbanevskaia and what she would say now, in so many different ways, how would she behave right now. And we created this panel at AWP conference about the Soviet dissidents of the 1960s. And you translated Gorbanevskaia for that. Just a few words about it. And is there any relevance of that experience of a few years ago to today, the 23rd of May?
Well, Danny had translated Gorbanevskaia, so I had her books, and I have read and even translated a little of her just to read her because of who she was. And then when we were putting together this panel, And when we were presenting it, I remember as I was reading, there was this sense of that came from the side. It was like a huge feeling of doom. And I think it was, I don't know, which year did we do that? 2016? But 2017, yes. So Trump was already president. But I felt what happened to Russia could happen to this country. I had an incredible sense of impending doom. And I don't know if you caught it, but my voice thickened. I was so moved by this strange feeling, okay? And it has happened. And it's very concerning, you know. And I think the first time that I felt that viscerally, that this could happen, that very bad things could happen, was at that presentation. And it was appropriate because what was it? It was the 50th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Prague.
So then it must be 2018.
Yes.
Yeah. Mary Jane White, thank you so much. It was so wonderful to see you again, to talk about all these things again. And so many things came up in the conversation that I wouldn't expect. And they're all wonderful. I wish you every success with more Tsvetaeva and more translations and all your endeavors, new books. I think you have a new book out. Please show it. Yes.
This is a book of poems about raising my son, and it's quite accessible. And I'm going around this fall doing Tsvetaeva readings and also reading to autism groups.
Can you please say the title of the book?
The title of the book is Dragonfly Toad Moon. It's published by Press 53 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I would appreciate it if you take a look.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Irina. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you. Bye-bye.